Unlock Season 14 with the key of imagination. Beyond it is another dimension. A dimension of film, a dimension of scares, a dimension of discussion. You're moving into a land of both humor and substance, of facts and intros. You've just crossed over into the Horrific Podcast. All right, so we're cruising right along here through Season 14, and we are taking a look at some episodes of the show The Twilight Zone and talking specifically about how they influenced horror movies.
Yep.
Sometimes that influence is very direct, as in the movie basically just remade the episode in a slightly longer story.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes it's more of like an influence, like there was an idea or a feeling in it that seemed like a good concept, and then a horror movie maker took that and turned it into kind of its own thing. And then there's some that I think are a little bit more hard to directly trace.
Yeah.
Where it's like the Twilight Zone did a thing in an episode that was an interesting concept, and then we've seen that kind of manifest itself in different ways. And that could be an element of the story, that could be an element of the filming, or it could even be just kind of the general mood or the way that they've presented this idea. But I think if you look at horror movie directors who are honest, that's an important part. A lot of them will admit that they took inspiration from the Twilight Zone. And so far this season, we have pointed out a lot of cases where that's really obvious, whether the director admitted it or not.
It's been one of the most important pieces of this season 14.
Yeah. So this episode is probably the least direct influence.
Mm-hmm.
In that I think we have some examples of, maybe it's not as direct a line. It's not like it's a story about a, doll that comes to life and kills people that got, that was the inspiration for a movie about a doll that came to life and killed people, or Poltergeist.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like this one's a little more subtle. But I actually found a really interesting article on a site called Horror Homeroom. And the article is called 5 Twilight Zone Episodes That Influenced Modern Horror Film. And there was something on there about this one, the episode that we're going to talk about this week, that I thought was just a really, really good catch, but is also a good example of one of these cases where we're talking about this concept or this idea from a Twilight Zone episode that has been used in a lot of different ways in horror movies since then. But then it also had some pretty direct connections, I think, to the way that Night of the Living Dead was shot when they made that movie 5 years later. So, yeah.
Initially, when we were looking at the list, so you had sent me the list and like a couple articles, and I read the list first because I always read the meat of the email and then go to the links. It's just how I work. Sense. And I remember seeing this one. It was just like, oh man, because I had just watched, just started rewatching them, and this was one that I'd rewatched, and I was like, I don't know, man. I don't know how this is going to play out. Did some reading on the article. I was like, okay, that makes more sense. And then after watching it, I was like, this makes complete sense. So I'm excited to talk about this episode with you.
Yeah. So the episode that we're going to talk about is called I Am the Night, Color Me Black. It was from Season 5, Episode 26, released in 1964. And I have to admit, I don't know that I ever saw this one. Like, it was probably on TV in the background, but I just, zoned out. Because, we've talked about how I think fondness for the Twilight Zone really started when they would do marathons of it on TV on holidays. Yeah. So there would be, the 4th of July Twilight Zone marathon, or the Labor Day 48 hours of Twilight Zone or whatever. And we would both just watch that all day long while we were doing other stuff.
Right.
And some of these episodes are really kind of attention grabbing. some episodes are a little more of like a slow burn, and so if there was other stuff going on, it would be really easy to kind of like lose track of them. Yeah. And I feel like this one may kind of fit into that latter category.
Yeah, I could definitely see that for sure. I think the only reason I did is just because streaming, like I just had it continuously playing, and so it was just it was just doing its thing. But yeah, I didn't necessarily remember it from a long time ago, but you know, those were the days of no streaming and VCRs, you know.
Yeah.
To record VCRs to record what was on TV. That's what we were we used back then. So
yeah, I would record long stretches of episodes that were on during those marathons and then go back and watch them. Mm-hmm. This was definitely not one that I ever had on tape. So I feel like there are like random stretches of episodes that I've seen a billion times, right. And then there are ones that I've maybe have seen, you know, parts of in the background. So anyway, it was nice going into it with this one, just because I didn't feel like I knew all the plot points ahead of time. It was still, I was kind of waiting for it to unfold. Mm-hmm. But it was not exactly my heart wasn't pounding. This one I feel like was a very, very like straightforward, to the point. You kind of knew what was happening in the beginning. There wasn't really a big twist. It was really just like kind of, and I think we've seen other episodes like this in the Twilight Zone where really it's just almost like a parable or like a morality tale. And they're not really going to like make a big twist or make you feel weird or anything. It's more along the lines of, here is a visual play of a moral concept. And I think this one is that type of episode, specifically around hate and a little bit racism, which, you know, on the right side of history there.
Yeah, I say hate, racism, but as well as like how community decides what's the you know, like with zombie movies, it's about not just the zombies, it's a lot what's going on in the environment that's kind of deciding. Sure. So it's like, is George gonna kill, you know, the other survivor, like kind of thing. I felt like that's this as well. I don't know what to call that.
Well, now you're getting into what I think is where this has had the big influence.
Gotcha.
And so with this one,
should you?
Well, I guess go ahead.
Should you describe it?
Oh, yeah, probably.
First?
Yeah, okay.
You're just good at it.
No, I got this.
Okay.
So yeah, before we get into that, I'll do a quick recap, and then we can talk about, you know, sort of the horror influences. But in general, with this one, the story was pretty straightforward. It is the story of a man who has been convicted of murder in a small town. And on the day that the man is to be executed, everyone wakes up and it's dark outside. And as the day goes on, it stays dark outside. So even when it's 9:30 in the morning and it should be sunny, it's still like it's the middle of the night. You find out that the sheriff and the deputy actually were not completely honest in the way that this man was convicted. It implies that what he did was out of self-defense towards a racist, and that the town liked the guy who got killed more than the guy who did the killing, because the guy who did the killing was kind of odd and an outsider, whereas the guy who got killed was the type of person who would help keep the town the way they like it and not changing, you might say, from a racial perspective. And so whatever happened between them, he ended up shooting the other guy. He was condemned under false testimony, mainly from the deputy, but also the sheriff knowingly overlooked some evidence. So he's taken to the gallows and they hang him while it's still dark out. But then a preacher comes forward and says that basically the darkness that has enveloped the town is just the physical manifestation of their hate. And that yes, this man was guilty, but also all of you were guilty, and this is what we get for it. And then you hear the, I guess, sheriff and deputy and a reporter all back in the police station listening to the radio and hearing that this same thing is happening in these different places around the world that are also centers of hate and conflict. So like the Berlin Wall and North Korea and Birmingham, Alabama, which at the time was, had lots of racial violence and stuff like that going on. So that's kind of the summary of the episode. Again, not a lot of plot points. It's a lot of dialogue and just kind of telling you what happened and what is happening.
Mm-hmm.
And so I don't think that there's a lot of influences coming out of this story-wise, but some things about the feeling of it and the general concept of it, I think, are interesting. But before we get into those, there were 2 scenes in this one that were basically mirrored in Night of the Living Dead. And I cannot take credit for noticing this. This was based on that article by Don Keatley from Horror Homeroom. And there's even some pictures next to each other. And the article is called 5 Twilight Zone Episodes That Influence Modern Horror Film. And one of them is subtitled Mob Scenes in I Am the Night and Night of the Living Dead. And it's the scene where the townspeople are all walking in the dark up towards the gallows to watch the guy be hanged. And then the one next to it is when all the zombies are starting to gather outside the house in Night of the Living Dead. And it really is like a similar film style. It's really interesting, and it helps, obviously both were in black and white, but kind of the way that the shot was set up. And in both cases, the people have like very similar demeanor. And so I think what they were going for in the Twilight Zone episode was that these people are almost being like controlled by their hatred as opposed to like making their own choices. They're all seen as kind of almost like a unified like hive mind as opposed to individuals, which is kind of interesting when you think about that in the zombie context. And then the other scene was at the very end, like I mentioned, the newspaper guy, the deputy, and the sheriff are all in the police station listening to a news report on the radio where they're finding out about how this weird experience that they're having is actually happening in lots of other areas around the world. And they're starting to hear the news, and you're sort of putting together what's actually going on, which was, kind of a key scene in Night of the Living Dead as well.
Yeah. It's strange though, because of how close, they came out together. But when we say this one came out in 64, I think. Yeah. Night of the Living Dead came out in 68. So it's definitely possible, man.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, they were really close together. But the other side of that is, okay, cool. They were made in a similar era. That means they probably used similar equipment, lighting techniques, and all of that stuff, which probably gave, the 2 things a similar visual aesthetic and whatever. But the bigger thing that I wanted to talk about with this one was just kind of this idea of being in an area and the whole world around you changes and you have to decide how you're going to react to it. And so in this one, the way they reacted was, well, we just got to still make sure this guy gets hanged.
Yeah.
Like there wasn't really much beyond that. But if you think about, Night of the Living Dead, well, people are trapped in the house. They're fearful of the unknown outside. And then they start to tear each other apart, kind of from the stress and the internal conflict. If you think about movies like The Mist, that's the one, right? Where they're in the mall.
Yeah.
But yeah, with The Mist, obviously, like there's this fog.
They were
outside
in the superstore.
Yes, you're right.
Yeah.
You're right. It was the mall. It was the store. Yeah. And they're trapped in this store. And then a lot of the movie is kind of how the people are interacting with each other. But then there's also these mysterious kind of scary things outside that they can't see super well. And so they have to make decisions about like how they're going to interpret that and what they want to do. And so this idea of we're combined together, sort of having to deal with this larger thing that's happening around us, I think is a thing that you see in a lot of horror movies made after this time period.
Yep.
And the only place where it really, really got into it here was like the the people were all like, all right, we're not going to let this stop us from doing the thing that we want to do, which is to basically hang the guy. But then after that, they're like, okay, well, now what are we left with? Like the thing that was uniting us is gone. So now what do we do? And the deputy is now no longer fighting with the newspaper guy. He's like, well, surely the sun's going to come back out, right? Like this will all be okay soon, right? Like he's turning to this person that he just had this big confrontation with and is just looking for any sort of like human connection and comfort, because you can tell he's getting like more stressed out by the situation. And so again, I can't really point to a movie that I can say, yes, they copied this storyline, but I think that idea of putting people together in a dangerous or unknown situation and then seeing how that makes them interact and how that changes is a core concept to a lot of horror movies that we've watched over the last however many years.
Yeah, I think that what it is almost, at least in my opinion, is that it's what we would get. This episode is what we would get if there were like no zombies, or maybe a zombie in Night of the Living Dead. You know what I mean? So it's not in a negative way at all. It's just like this, being that there's no zombies in this episode. Like it is a lot about the internal strife, because like reading up on the episode is talking like the sheriff is like going back and forth because he's up for re-election, and so that plays a part. And it's just like the environment is deciding this. It's maybe a little less intense considering the situation, because they're hanging a person, but in Night of the Living Dead they're being attacked, like kind of thing. Maybe it's from the point of view of the person being hung in a way with the Night of the Living Dead, if that makes sense. But yeah, I think that this is almost even a little bit more terrifying, and we just saw it with what was the second Halloween, the last one that we had watched. I think it was from 2018. Was it 2018? The remakes. It wasn't the end, but where the community, it was like, this is what happens when the community's had enough.
Oh yeah.
And they come back together. I don't remember which.
Was that Halloween Kills?
It was Kills. Yeah, Halloween Kills. That's what it was. And so we just saw it. So like this is a big part. It's just like it's missing the Michael Myers or whatever in the bad guy. That's just the way I saw it. Like as I watched this, I was like, oh yeah, this is like if they chose not to hang that guy, like the sheriff may have been killed on the spot. You never know, but that's how I picked it up, just from the way they're acting.
Yeah, and I think this one was a little more almost like apocalyptic than it was, a particular thing in reality that was dangerous. And I think the biggest kind of point of it all was when that preacher turned to the crowd and said, he hated and he killed and he died. You hated, you killed, and now you're doomed. And talks about how like the darkness is the manifestation of their hatred.
Yeah.
And so it's almost like this concept of this thing that they've all created together is now their undoing or their eternal punishment. And the idea that it's not just going to go away, like they have to live with this, presumably forever, given how the episode ended. It's more of like a creepy thing than it is like oh yeah, this is a super energetic, action-filled face-off, at the end.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, realistically, if it was just that dark, I would just sleep more. You know what I mean?
Oh yeah, I'm all for it.
Yeah, flashlights. You can play flashlight tag anytime you want. You're not restricted to nighttime hours. So, like, if you ask me, being doomed doesn't sound that bad.
Compared to it being over 100 degrees every day for 50 days in a row, which is what has been the case here, I would take permanent nighttime in a minute.
Yeah, 100%. I think it was also kind of, for me, this was like definitely a slow burn episode, but it's easy to deal with slow burns when it's only like 20 minutes long.
Yeah, absolutely.
I have no beef with that, but I felt like this episode did fall short in the sense that a little bit more information may have been a little bit more handy to to get it past. But I think when you were saying it was almost like set up like a play, like early in this episode, like that made the most sense to me. But still, I just can't comprehend why it wasn't that big of a freak out that it was that dark outside. I'd be tripping out. And they still try to continue. Like, that's how much hate these people had.
Yeah.
That they're just like, screw the darkness. We got to hang this guy. It's really important for us to do.
Yeah. God, and it was like they couldn't even acknowledge the dangers that they were in because they were so focused on it.
Yeah.
And I think maybe that's the thing that really gives that scene the same feeling as the scene in Night of the Living Dead.
Yeah.
Because it's almost like, you know, these people are all just ready to eat brains / you know, all just ready to watch a guy get killed because, you know, he did a thing that they think they need to punish and somehow that's going to make their lives better. But they're not even paying attention to like the larger disaster that's going on around them.
Right. Yeah. Which, you know, is also what we kind of deal with today in a way. You have your head down on the phone enough, kind of miss out what's going around you. Not to get too philosophical.
What was that Netflix movie? Is it Don't Look Up?
Yeah, something like that.
That was kind of driving home at that point. But anyway.
It's crazy. All in all, though, I mean, like, this was a cool connection between the two. Or not just Night of the Living Dead. I mean, those scenes specifically, but, like, the content of it. Like, it's pretty
Here's
good.
What I liked about it. There's no controversy here. There's no director that, like, obviously ripped with this one off that then was like, I mean, I don't know about that.
Oh, that's true.
And then, you know, like, hired the person who wrote the short story it was based on to write another one of their movies so they didn't get sued. I mean, it's nice not to have to deal with controversy for a change, you know?
Yeah, and listen, there's one thing we try to stay away from is controversy. That's why we have to edit a lot of cuss words out that Daniel says. But I don't remember where I was going with that.
I mean, I would take my cuss words over the explicit things that you talk about any day of the week.
I leave those in.
You can always tell who edited the episode.
You can. Who has the most cuss words?
You can always tell who edited the damn episode.
Yeah. That's a good catch. Yeah.
But yeah, this was fun. This one, I don't know. It's always fun to watch an episode of the Twilight Zone and find new connections to other stuff. And so I really enjoyed the article that I found on Horror Homeroom because it goes into other episodes as well. And some of them we had talked about doing for this season, but honestly, they were inspirations for movies that we hadn't seen yet. And so it didn't really make sense to talk about a movie that we haven't previously reviewed as being influenced by the Twilight Zone. So there's plenty of lists out there of horror movies with like direct Twilight Zone influences. And so if this is a thing that interests anyone else, then you can definitely do some reading on your own and find way more to go check out. But if this is a thing that does not interest you, well, buckle up because we've only got one more week of this. And then we'll be back to what is our normal format, which is more where we watch a horror movie and then talk about it.
Yep. And also, just to be completely transparent with the listener, this season is so that we can also get a couple weeks off from recording and posting. Just to be upfront, right? That's the thing. And so we were like, well, let's not do another 6 months of a season. Let's just keep it short. So if there are any others and you like us doing it, let us know. But also, I highly recommend you research it for yourself because there's a ton of connections that I realized just today, actually, when I was doing a little bit of research for this or for next episode. But anyway. Appreciate everyone listening, though.
Yeah, thanks for coming along on the ride.
And here's the thing, last thing, sorry. This is a safe place for making fun of South Dakota. They still don't listen to our podcast. So if you guys ever want to say anything bad about South Dakota, this is the place for it.
SD sucks.
I don't get why you guys have the highest, why you're on the list of the state that people are moving to the most. It's like people are moving out of California. Texas is on the list. Oklahoma's not, I guess it's Oklahoma. But South Dakota is on the list too. And it's like, why? People just want to be miserable. It's dark 24/7 there, I heard. Like, that's where this is based at, this episode.
Do you think South Dakota is full of hate?
It's only full of hate, Daniel.
And that's it for today's episode. If you've listened this far, then thank you, and we hope you've enjoyed it. We're always looking for new ideas, so if you have any questions, comments, or movie suggestions, please send us an email at thehorrificpod@gmail.com. Or hit us up on the IG. That's what the kids call Instagram. Just search for The Horrific Podcast. Thanks for listening.